Good evening,
Good evening.
and welcome to our final reading of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Tonight we read the last two chapters, Chapter 4, the third of the three spirits, and Chapter 5, the end of it. Tonight, in our story, we get to see Scrooge brought down to his lowest point, his humblest point, where he sees his life as it will be if he continues in the hardness, in the bitterness, in the greed. He sees a world absent of himself and better for it. And he desires to change. And then in the end, we see the most joyous picture in the whole story. Scrooge's reclamation, his salvation, his redemption. He comes to himself in joy and gladness. And so, let us go to the final chapter, and let us watch Scrooge as he is brought low and then raised up again. And now just a warning to all of you young listeners and readers.
Is this?
The second to last chapter, the penultimate chapter, is a little bit scary and spooky. Yes, that's right. The ghost of Christmas yet to come is shrouded in mist and darkness. So, let us open up our book and read the final two chapters of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Chapter 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for the very air through which the spirit moved seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was shrouded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed downward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that not so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer Scrooge received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and then he found he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover, but Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, and while he, though he stretched his own to the uttermost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future!" he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any of the spectre I have seen. As I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is fading fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as it came toward him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up. He thought and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them as of its own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on 'change among the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often do. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I do not think much about it. I don't know either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first man with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous exercise at the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the speaker, "for upon my life I don't know anyone who will go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind going if lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose. "But I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am most distressed among you after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch. But I'll offer to go for anybody else if they will. When I come to think of it, I'm not sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men, and looked toward the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided into the street. Its finger pointed towards two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I am told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time." "You're not a skater, I suppose?" "Oh, no. Something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have had some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that to whosoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of the riddles easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured through the porch. It gave him a little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolution carried out in this. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with his outstretched hand. And when he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied, from the turn of his hand, and its situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the business scene, and went into an obscure part of the town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, and ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell, and dirt, and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, and with misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed, beetling shop, below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were all brought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frosty curtaining of miscellaneous tatters hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman bearing a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been on the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
"Let the charwoman alone be the first,"
cried she who had entered first.
"Let the laundress alone be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it."
"You couldn't have met in a better place,"
said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth.
"Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know. And the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. How it squeaks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. We're all matched. Come into the parlour. Come into the parlour."
The parlour, the space behind the screen of rags, the old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stream of his pipe, and put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the women who had already spoken threw their bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing their elbows on their knees, and looking with bold defiance at the other two.
"What are the odds, then? What are the odds, Mrs. Dibbler?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so than he." "Why, then, don't stand and staring as you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose."
"No, indeed," said Mrs. Dibbler and the man together.
"Who, we should hope not." "Oh, very well, then," cried the other woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss for these few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose."
"No, indeed,"
said Mrs. Dibbler, laughing.
"If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, that wicked old screw,"
pursued the woman,
"why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been natural, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gaping out on the floor like that, all alone by himself."
"'Tis the truest word you've ever spoke,"
said Mrs. Dibbler.
"It's a judgment on him."
"I wish it was a little heavier one," replied the woman, "and it should have been, you may depend on it, if I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joel, and let's know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, old Joe."
But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man faded into black, mounting the breach first, produced its plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severely examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked up the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up to a total when he found that there was nothing more to come.
"That's your account," said old Joe, "and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I were to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?
Mrs. Dibbler was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated in the wall in the same manner.
I will always give too much to ladies. It's an awkwardness of mine, a weakness of mine. That's the way I always ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you ask me for another penny, and make it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and not have a crown.
And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman.
Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains.
Aha! Returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms.
Bed curtains. You don't mean to say that you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe.
Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not?
You were born to make a fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it.
I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can't get anything in it by reaching out for the sake of such a man as he was, I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets?
asked Joe. Whose else do you think? replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without them, I dare say.
I hope he didn't die of catching anything, eh? said old Joe, stopping his work and looking up.
Don't you be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. Ha! You may look through the shirts till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if they had been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
said old Joe. Putting it on somebody to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it's good enough for anything. It's quite as being becoming to a body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped about their spoil, in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself.
Ha ha ha!
laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground.
'Tis the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he's dead. Ha 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 ha!
Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot.
I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own case. My life tends that way now. Merciful heavens, what is this?
He recoiled from terror, for the scene had changed. And now he almost touched a bed, a bare uncurtained bed, on which beneath a ragged sheet there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced around it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unkept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest rising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death! Set upon thine altar here, and dress it with such tears as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, and the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice had pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice? Hard dealing? Gripping cares? They have brought him to a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. "Spirit," he said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go." Still the spirit pointed with an unmoved finger toward the head. "I understand you, Spirit," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power." Again it seemed to look upon him. "If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me, Spirit. I beseech thee, show that person to me." The phantom spread its dark robe before him like a moment, like a wing, and then withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her child were. She was expecting someone with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, stared at every sound, and looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of her children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight, of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down at dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good or bad?" she said to help him. "Bad," he answered. "Oh, we are quite ruined." "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents," she said, amazed, "there is hope. Nothing is past hope, if such a miracle has happened." "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He is dead." She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. "What the half-drunken woman who I told you about last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but he was dying then." To whom has our debt been transferred?" "I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor as his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter as well, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by this event, was one of pleasure. "Let me see some tenderness connected with this death," said Scrooge, "or that dark chamber spirit, which we left just now, will be forever present to me." The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling with which he had visited before, and found the mother and children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as creatures in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where Scrooge had heard these words, he had not dreamed then. The boy must have read them out, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table, and put her hand to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim. "They're better again now," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I don't want to show weakness to your father when he comes home for the world. Oh, it must be near time." "Past it is, rather," Peter answered, shutting up the book. "But I think he has walked a little more slowly than he used to these last evenings, mother." They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, "I have known him walked with, and I have known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulders very fast indeed." "Oh, and so have I," cried Peter, "often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. So had all. "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work, "and his father loved him so, that it was no trouble, and there is your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob, in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should keep him up the most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each little child in a little cheek, face against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to the whole family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Robert. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good, to see how green the place is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart perhaps than they were. He left the room, and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and he went downstairs again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. "On which," said Bob, "for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you've ever heard, I told him. 'I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit,' he said, 'and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he could ever know that, I don't know.' "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everyone knows that," cried Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do. Heartily sorry," he said, "for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way," he said, giving me his card, "that's where I live. Pray come to me." "Now, it wasn't," cried Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt sorrow with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," cried Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be sure of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be surprised at all, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation." "Oh, only to hear that, Peter," said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Oh, get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. It's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us. Never, father, cried they all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. Never, no, father, they all cried again. I am very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and his daughters kissed him, the 2 young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand, I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom the ghosts and I saw lying dead? The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these later visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of businessmen, but he showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not say for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court, said Scrooge, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in these days to come. The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. Oh, the house is yonder. Why do you point away? The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hesitated to the window at his office and looked in. It was an office still, but it was not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man, whose name he had now to learn, lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced toward it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be? Or are they shadows of things that may be only? Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead, said Scrooge. But, if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it thus, with what you are to show me. The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name. Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man who lay upon the bed? He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. No, spirit, oh no, no! The finger was still there. Spirit! He cried, clutching at his robe. Hear me! I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been, but for this intercourse. Why, show me this, spirit, if I am past all hope. For the first time the hand appeared to shake. Good spirit, he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it. Your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. The kind hand trembled. "I will honor Christmas in my heart, and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me, that I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony, he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free himself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Chapter 5. The End of It. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future," Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. "The spirits of all three shall strive within me. O Jacob Marley, heaven and Christmas time be praised for this. I say upon my knees, O Jacob, on my knees." He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his voice broke and would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. "They're not torn down!" cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arm. "They're not torn down, rings and all! They are here! I am here! The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be! I know they will be!" His hands were busy with his garments all the time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties of every kind of extravagance. "I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect lacoon of himself with his stockings. "I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to the whole world. Halloo! Whoop, whoop, halloo!" He had frisked into the room, and was now standing there, perfectly winded. "There's a saucepan with the gruel that was in it," cried Scrooge, starting off again and going round the fireplace. "There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered, and there's the corner where the ghost of Christmas Present sat, and there's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. Oh, it's all right here. It's all true. It all happened." Oh, really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh that Scrooge gave off, the most illustrious laugh, the father of a long line of brilliant laughs. "Oh, I don't know what day of the month it is," said Scrooge. "I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello! Whoop! Hello here!" He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, ding, dong, hammer, clash, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold, cold, piping for the blood to dance in, golden sunlight, heavenly sky, fresh, sweet air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. "What is today?" cried Scrooge, calling down to a boy in Sunday clothes who perhaps had loitered in to look about at him. "Eh?" returned the boy, with his mite of wonder. "What is today, my fine fellow?" said Scrooge. "Well, today? Today's Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day," Scrooge said to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Oh, they can do anything. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow." "Hello," returned the boy. "Do you know the Pulchers in the next street?" "Oh, yes, the one by the corner." "I should hope I do," replied the lad. "An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there?" "Not the little prize turkey, the big one." "What, the one as big as me?" returned the boy. "Oh, what a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Oh, yes, my buck." "Oh, it's hanging there now," replied the boy. Is it? Oh, go and buy it.
Walker! Exclaimed the boy.
No. I am in earnest. Go and buy it, and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Oh, come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger. Who could have shot off fast as that?
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's,
whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh.
He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not such a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, awaiting his arrival, a knocker caught his eye.
I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge, patting the knocker with his hand. I scarcely ever looked on it before. What an honest expression it has on its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Ah, here's the turkey. Hello! Whoop! How are you? Merry Christmas!
It was a turkey. You have never seen such a turkey to stand upon its legs as that bird. He would have snapped 'em short in a minute, like sticks off a sealing wax.
Why, it's impossible to carry to Camden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair and chuckled till he was tired. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you're doing it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticker plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people by this time were pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delightful smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you," and Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe souls he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far, when coming on towards him he beheld the portly gentleman, who had walked into his counting-house the day before, and said, "Scrooge Marley's, I believe." It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it.
"My dear sir," said Scrooge, quickening his pace, and taking the old gentleman by both hands, "how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes," said Scrooge, "that's my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask you your pardon, and will you have the goodness—" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me!" cried the gentleman, as if breath were taken away. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favour?" "Oh, my dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say for such a "Don't say anything. Don't say anything, please. Come and see me, will you? Will you come and see me?" "I will," cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. "Thank ye. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times, said Scrooge. He went to church, and walked about the streets, and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head, and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses, and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his step toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash to it, and he did it. "Is this your master's house? Is he at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl who came to the door. "Nice girl, very nice." "Oh, yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" "He is in the dining-room along with the mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please." "Oh, thank you, he knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining-room lock. I'll go in here, my dear.
He turned it gently, sidled his face in, round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in a great array, for these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points, and like to see that everything is right. "Fred!" said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started! Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with the footstool, or he wouldn't have done it by any account. "Why, bless my soul!" cried Fred. "Who's that?"
"It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you please let me in, Fred?"
Let him in. It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came in. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was there early. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. And yes, he did. He did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1/4 past. No Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter, too. He was on his way to his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hullo!" growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir," said Bob. "I am behind my time." "You are," repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." "Oh, it's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I'm not going to stand for this thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool, giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore, I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clasped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal-scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the onset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for Scrooge. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one. The end.
Wow.
How about that, girls? Was that the happiest you've ever seen anybody?
Yes.
I know. Scrooge is someone who is said to have kept Christmas and keeps Christmas to the last. And may that be said of every one of us. Thank you so much for joining us as we've read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. It has been a joy, and we wish you a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Bye.
Thank you, girls.
Bye,
You guys
bye,
are
bye,
awesome.
bye, bye.